Now we're recording. Thankfully, that was the review stuff. So to anyone watching this, apologies for not getting the quick crash course of what we did during last meeting. So without further ado, we can start talking about command line stuff. But before we go directly into that, we have to understand a concept in GitHub. And what better way to understand concepts than by using visuals to do so? So when we're dealing with the command line, and the command line is essentially a some application that allows us to do various tasks on a computer. If you wanted to delete a file, you could do that through your file explorer, like this. But you can also do that through the command line, and you can do a lot more through the command line. But I digress from what the command line is capable of. But essentially, when we're dealing with command line stuff with GitHub, there is a concept that we have to, or some terminology that we need to understand. And everyone can see the image that I have on the screen, right?
Yeah, you're good.
All right. So we have to understand, we need some new vocabulary to describe what we're dealing with. So we have this new word, upstream. We have this new word, origin, which for now we have this new word, origin, and we have this word, local. So before we get into what upstream and origin mean, we have to make these new two definitions. The word local versus remote. So when you're working with code that is on GitHub in a repository, you're more than likely going to be making changes to the code, not on the GitHub website like we've done so far, but rather you want to do it on some text editor of your preference. So to do that, we have to download the repository. And essentially, that downloaded repository is referred to as a local repository. And it's local because it's only local to the personal computer that we are using. So all the code that I have on my computer for the repository, and let me pull up my file explorer to illustrate. So all this code here is in my local repository. And that essentially, and like I mentioned, local just means like on our computer, and not available to anyone else. The internet cannot access your local repositories unless some hacker is able to do so. But essentially, local means it's yours and only yours to modify. It's not going to be reflected on the GitHub website. So if I were to destroy like the entire website with some change by editing one specific line on my computer, then that change would not be reflected under the repository in GitHub, the website, unless I updated that code, which we'll get to soon. So that's a local repository. And a remote repository is essentially just a repository that's on the internet or on the GitHub website. It's a bit more complex than that in reality, but for the purposes of what we're doing, because we don't use like servers that exist in like a different state, just think of a remote repository as any repository that is on the GitHub website. So the Wiki 2020 repository under my account name, that is a remote repository on GitHub. The Wiki 2020 repository under the iGEM account, that is a remote repository because that is specifically on the GitHub website, and it is not on my computer. My computer has the local repository, and the local repository, granted, is a copy of this repository, but it's not, but making changes to the local repository will not automatically mean that the remote repository that's under my account name on GitHub will be updated. Does that make sense in terms of the distinction between a local and remote repository? All right, so, oh, I,
It just says it does.
okay. And if we're good, since we're good with that, we can now go on to into explaining what upstream and origin mean. So upstream and origin both refer to remote repositories. And essentially, looking at this diagram, upstream refers to the original official repository. So in our case, our upstream repository, and upstream isn't like, I guess the best way to think of it is that upstream is not like a de facto like name that everyone has to adhere to, but it's just the general standard that people use. Upstream refers to the official account or repository, sorry, that we are basing our local copy off of. So in this case, our upstream repository is the iGEM Wiki 2020 repository, the one that's specifically under the iGEM account. It would not be this one. It would be the one that's under the official account of interest, and that means by extension that origin is referring to the repository that was the forked repository, which we kind of see in the labeling up here. So the original repository being the one under the iGEM account, and the origin repository is the repository that was forked, or rather put under our account name. So this would be the forked repository under my own account name or your account name, and this would be the upstream repository. And the reason why it's called upstream is that because since all of us have forked the iGEM repository into our own accounts, we all might make different changes at different times. So, or rather, we might, in order to, we might make, let me rephrase that. We would be making different changes to different files. So, in order to have those files be updated and stop one person, prevent it from just being like one person can only work on one file at a specific point in time, everyone essentially makes updates the upstream repository with their own forked repository changes, and then from there people can get the updated code from the upstream account, which is essentially like, if we think of so going back to like the commit, or not the commit tree, but like going back to the analogy that a GitHub repository is kind of like a tree. If this is like the master, I'll just use M for master. If this is the master repository or the upstream repository, sorry, and so if that's the upstream repository and we have 3 people who forked it, they're essentially taking the repository they're essentially taking the repository upstream. I know that's kind of a crappy explanation as to why it's called upstream, but that's just the convention that people use. So we're going to use that for now to avoid ambiguity. So, so just to recap that, upstream repository is the official repository on GitHub. The repository we're calling Origin is the one that's under our own account name, but on the GitHub website. And the local repository is the one that is like downloaded on a computer, which would be like the folder with all the files in this case. So now, without further ado, we can start talking about command line stuff. So everything that I should say, so this is CM Commander for Windows. Everything I say should be like, should translate pretty much the same to all the other operating systems or command terminals. So, but if it doesn't, like, make sure to speak up and say that this doesn't match one for one. The only thing that might be different is just how this application presents things to the user compared to another command terminal, and that shouldn't really impact how we're able to do things in command line. So yeah, that's a better way of explaining it than I did. So thanks for putting that, Jay. So I'm going to assume that everyone read the like intro to command line document that I whipped up together, but if not, it's all good. We're only going to really be using one command that's not Git related. It's just going to be this command called cd, which stands for change directory, and directory is just like a folder. So we're going to go to the specific GitHub folder, and in order to do stuff with the repository, we have to be inside the specific repository folder. So in this case, the repository is called Wiki 2020. So we go to Wiki 2020. This master origin text here isn't going to appear for everyone. So don't be worried if it doesn't. You just have to know that if you're under your repository folder, you should be good. So let's go over some basic Git commands. So there's one called, well, before we do that, let's kind of explain how the general workflow is. So the idea with a local repository is that as you make changes to it, you push them to your forked repository, which is the one that's under your account name. And then after you push those changes to update your remote or your forked repository, you then make a pull request so that those changes are reflected in the official repository. So if we think of it as, so in terms of how the workflow operates, in terms of like updating the official repository, we make changes on our local machine. We push those changes or commit those changes to the forked repository, and then those changes go to our official or original repository by making a pull request. And there's and we'll go into how to do that soon. So let me get rid of that. So some basic commands. First, you're going to have to do anything Git related, you have to type Git for the command terminal to recognize that you're doing a Git command. So everything should start with Git. And the most basic command is git version, which just git version, which just tells you what version of Git you have on your computer. There is a command called clear. That's more just a generic command prompt thing, but it just clears everything that was already on your screen so that you have like a fresh empty screen to work with. So we went over Git version, and there's also the most important one probably, well, all of them are important, but an important one is Git status. And what that says is essentially we look at the repository that we have downloaded, and we compare it to the repository that is the remote copy of it. So with Git status, we compare our local repository to the forked repository that this local repository is a copy of. So to illustrate what would happen if we make a change. So let's say, let me just do something real quick. So all right, so let me close this out and open it again.
Alit, I had a question.
Yeah, sorry. What is it?
So to basically get the repository to show up on the command terminal, you'd have to download it from GitHub, right?
Yeah, oh, I should have probably gone into how to do that. Thank you for reminding me. So to do that, I'll just run through that quickly right now. So to download the repository, the way we do that is we go to the repository, our forked repository, or whatever repository we want. So in this case, I'll just use the repository that I was messing around with a couple days ago. So to do that, we select clone or download, and there we're given a link that ends with, I'm not sure if you guys can see it, but it ends with like a .git. So if it ends with a .git, GitHub is, or the command terminal is able to recognize that as like a repository on the internet. So to download it, we go to the folder we want to place the repository in. We say git clone, and then we paste the repository URL that we copied from here, and then press enter to run it. So now it said it finished. So if we go to the folder that I placed it in, we'll see that this test repo repository is now popping up. So I guess everyone should probably do that with the iGEM repository that they forked, or rather their forked copy of the iGEM repository. And then from there, you'll be able to make changes to your own local copy. Are there any questions regarding how to like download a repository to your own computer? All right, and if someone's having difficulty downloading the repository, then feel free to speak up anytime. So let's go back to the wiki repository. So the thing with working with repositories on your computer, similar to how you have branches. Let me go back to the wiki repository. Nope. Here we go. So similar to how we have branches for repositories, the same thing applies for. Oh, where did my tabs go? Oh, there it is. So similar to how we have to work in a specific branch on, if we do everything on GitHub, we work on a specific branch on our local computer when we download the repository to our computer. So with Commander, it shows which repository you're in. I don't think that Linux or like the command prompts do the same. So if you like make multiple branches, you'll have to like manually check which branch you're in. But for now, like you should automatically be placed in the master branch, so you don't have to worry about like switching a branch or anything. So, but just know that whatever changes you make on your own computer will be done under the master branch of your forked repository that is on your computer. So now, all right. Let me exit out of this. So first there's the workflow of the whole. So we said before that with like the workflow of the whole like working on your computer with the repository to making those changes official, we start with our local repository, which is on our computer. We push those changes to the remote or online repository that is under our account, and then we have those changes be updated under the official repository, which is under the iGEM account in this case. So let's do something like that. So let's say I don't like I want to change the professional links tab that was in, just as a reminder, it was this column title on our table. Let's say I want to change it back to other, because I personally prefer that. So, and in addition to that, let's say I want to change contact to email. So we made those changes to the specific README file, and we saved those changes under our local repository. But just because we saved it like we would with the file does not mean that it is updating the remote repository that is on GitHub. So to actually do so, yeah, so you can see here that even when we refresh the page, we still have contact and professional links as our column titles, as opposed to email and other on our local repository. So to update those changes, we have to do a series of steps. So before we go into the steps, we can check. Well, first we have to check something called git status to understand. I think I referred to it a bit earlier, but git status, like I mentioned, essentially compares the local repository to the remote forked repository. So in this case, our message reads that our branch is ahead of the origin/master, which is essentially just the remote repository that is forked from the forked repository under our account. It says that our branch is ahead of origin/master by 3 commits, and it gives us that there's this modified file that is called README, which is the file that we indeed modified by changing the 2 column titles. So that shows us the differences between our local repository and forked remote repository. And in order to update the official repository with those changes, we have to go through a series of steps, which I've outlined in the Intro to GitHub guide. So if you don't remember that, you don't have to memorize them. You can always refer to this guide to essentially make sure everything goes smoothly. So the first thing we need to do is make sure to, and we already did it already, but the first step that we have to do is essentially say git pull upstream master. And what that says is, and what that does is it updates the it updates our local repository with the official code, or the code that's under like the official iGEM repository. So that's what that does. And I should probably talk about how to add a repository as upstream. So going back to this graphic, for every repository, the command line's not necessarily going to know which repository is upstream. It's not smart enough to like assume, it's not smart enough to deduce that because the repository is called Wiki 2020, we should look at the specific iGEM 2020, Wiki 2020 repository and have that be upstream. So we have to specify that under the specific local repository. And so to do that, and I don't think it should give me an error if I do that, but we essentially have to type git add upstream. And add is just like, it's a very versatile command, but essentially we're saying we're telling Git to have this upstream, have this repository, or we're telling Git to, for this local repository, have upstream be classified as the iGEM the iGEM Wiki 2020 repository. And the way we specify that specific repository is by using the link that we get from the cloner by clicking cloner download on the GitHub website. So if I was adding this repository as the upstream repository, I would say git add upstream, and then I'd paste that link. And then doing so would cause the and although this error popped up because I already did it, doing so should, I forget what the message is, but it should essentially mean that it should tell the local repository that the iGEM SBU Wiki 2020 repository is the upstream repository you should look at when you're being updated with the changes that are made. So let's say, for example, Jay made like a bunch of new files and uploaded them to the iGEM Wiki 2020 repository. If I want my local repository to reflect those changes, because remember, the local repository each of us has is under separate forked repositories that are each under our own account name. If I want my local repository to reflect the changes that are now in the iGEM Wiki repository, I would say git pull upstream master, which I already did, but it's just something to know in terms of like updating the code that you have, because more often than not, really all the time, the purpose of doing this or typing in this command is that you don't want to be updating your forked remote repository with outdated code. So if I don't have all the files that Jay put into the official repository that are under my local repository, then updating my own personal repository would like yeah, updating my own remote repository and then making a pull request would cause all kinds of errors because all of a sudden files are deleted and that would cause some things to break, and that's not what we want to do as programmers. So right before we update our remote repository with the code that we modified, we always say git pull upstream master, and I outlined this in the um, intro to GitHub guide. So you don't have to like memorize the workflow because it's all outlined for you guys. So we say git pull upstream master, which we already did, and then from there, we can see that there was this message before that says changes not staged for commit, and then it lists the files that are modified but not under the commit, which is essentially, if you guys remember, the equivalent of a save button for a repository. So to add the README to the commit we're going to make, we say git add dash capital uppercase, not capital case, uppercase A. And what the dash A does is it essentially adds all the files, or it looks at all the files under the repository, looks to see if they were modified in any way, and if they were, it adds them to the commit that we're making. So once we run git add dash capital A and say git status again, which is just a way for us to compare our local repository to the remote forked repository, we can see that we get a different message. We have changes to be committed, and we have modified readme.md in green. So it'll appear green for Commander, but this message should appear regardless of what command terminal you're using. So once we get this, and at the very least, you should definitely get this message of your branch is ahead of origin/master by 3 commits. So now that we have added the files to our commit, we're ready to make the commit. So there are two more steps that we have to take to update our forked remote repository. First is to say git commit -a-m, and then what each component of this, and then we put a quotation mark, which we'll fill in later. So this -a simply just takes all the commits that were made and then adds them to like, or how to, so it takes, I'm not sure what the -a does actually, but it's useful, or you need to have it. So I'll get a better explanation as to why the -a is there, but for now, just assume that it adds like all the files that might have been modified. So yeah, so git commit -a. All right, no problem. We'll make sure to like PM me or anyone who was at the workshop if you have any questions. So git commit -a, and then we have to include a -m, which indicates that we have a commit message. So similar to how whenever we made a commit to a file, via GitHub, we had similar to that, how we had to press this commit changes button. This -m means that we have to include a message, much like we did on the website. So the way we specify our message is by filling in the little quotes, double quotes that we have here. So let's say our message is just updated README table column names. So once we press enter, we'll have that commit stored under our local repository, ready to be pushed to our remote forked repository. But we haven't done that yet because we need to type one more command. And that command is git push. And then we have to specify two things. One is the repository that we want to push to. So in this case, you're always going to be putting push origin. And origin, if you guys remember from the little graphic here, is referring to the forked remote repository that we initially made when we made a local copy of the iGEM wiki under our own account. So origin, so git push origin, and then we have to specify the specific branch under our local repository that we want to update our remote repository with. So in this case, it's just master because we did not make any other branch, but it could be a different branch if you want it to be. So this command, git push origin master, is what you want to enter when you want your remote forked repository to be updated with all the changes that you make under your local repository. So if we press enter, it'll do some stuff. It might prompt you to enter your GitHub username and password to like verify that these are the changes you want to make, or like validate your identity in terms of like making those changes to your remote repository. But we can see that it says that it gives us like these various things. Don't worry about what all these say. Just know that once it finishes executing, if we refresh the page of our remote forked repository, we should have the column names updated to email and other, just like under our table here. So now what we can do is, like before, we can make a pull request on the GitHub website. There's a way to do that via command line, but we're not going to get into that because it can get a bit messy. So we click the pull request button. We create the pull request like before. And then we merge, confirm, and ta-da! We now have updated the official iGEM repository by making changes and pushing those changes to our remote forked repository via the command line. So in terms of like a homework assignment, if you guys want to call it that, something I want everyone who's attending to do is first update after you download the repository, or after you clone the repository to your computer, I would like everyone to, after typing in the command to update the repository with the upstream repository, which is git pull upstream master, just for reference. So after doing that, I want you guys to go to the README file, and I commented where, and I want you guys to fill out your respective rows. So I filled out in comments what to insert in each segment. So essentially it's just like enter your email address here, or enter your email address where this first comment is, and then enter like if you want some professional link that you have, whether it be a LinkedIn, a personal website, or something else. You don't have to if you don't have one, but if you do, then I guess just put that link here. And I kind of outline what will be displayed in each segment. So that's like your homework assignment. So like for Chu, he would put his email address here, and then if he has like a LinkedIn or something else, he would fill in the respective segments in this section here. So that's like the homework assignment. And then after you make those changes, push those changes to your remote fork repository via the steps that I showed, and then make a pull request to update the table under the official iGEM repository. So does anyone have any questions? I know that was a lot, so feel free to ask away. All right, so if not, I can stop the meeting for today. And let's see, is there anything else that needs to be, I don't think there's anything that needs to be discussed too much. So we can stop the meeting here. And if anyone wants to stay, I'm going to stay on for like a couple minutes. So if anyone wants to stay on afterwards to ask some questions individually to me, feel free to do that. So, all right. And I'll put this recording under the YouTube channel, right, Liba?
Yeah, do the YouTube channel. It might take a while to process, but that's where we're putting the videos now.
Okay. And I'll make sure to title it appropriately.
Sounds good.
All right. So, thank you. So, you got your homework assignment for this week. You guys know what to do. Reach out to me if you have any questions, and I'll help walk you through them the best to my abilities. And yeah, that's pretty much all.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good day, guys.
Yo.
Have a good day.
See you, boss.
Yo, Audit.
Mm-hmm.
Get